Welcome to Planet Poetry. My name is Peter Kenny.
And I'm Robin Houghton. And our loose theme for this episode is X's and O's and zeros and ones. So you can make of that what you can.
It's very enigmatic. And this episode, Robin will also be talking to Kathryn Maris.
That was a great interview. I really enjoyed doing that. But before we get into Kathryn Maris, Peter.
Yes.
What have you been up to lately?
Well, it's been a world of work, weirdly, after a year of tumbleweed and crows in my freelance work. I've actually been really busy. Yeah, that's been very welcome. There are doubloons cascading into the Kenny coffers after a long period of nothing.
Oh, fantastic. We can start paying for the Planet Poetry podcast now, can't we?
Yes, we can. I still owe you a check, I think. So how have you been?
Very well, thank you. Yes, like everybody in the world, looking forward to the future, but still trying to live in the moment, obviously. Mm-hmm. I've been up to my neck in reading for my course, which is anything Dante related. But of course, nothing is wasted when one is reading Dante. It's just the poem that just keeps giving, the Divine Comedy. I think every time you read it, something new comes up. And you first told me that, I think, that you go back to it.
Yeah, I seem to go to the same bits, though, all the time. But I just love the beginning. Actually, this is me all over. I just love the beginning. And I give up. Well, I just love the whole business about being stuck in that dark wood at the beginning where the straight way is lost.
Well, it is a fantastic beginning, and people have written entire theses on that, I think, on just that first tercet, haven't they? I think I read somewhere that Tennyson, or it might have been Tennyson anyway, he spent his whole life worrying about one little tercet in the entire 100 cantos of the Divine Comedy, and just kept worrying about it and going back to it. So It does have that effect on people.
Yeah, it is an amazing business. Right. So perhaps we should press on with Planet Poetry. So here's Robin's chat with Kathryn Maris.
Kathryn Maris has 3 collections of poetry, the most recent of which is The House with Only an Attic and a Basement from Penguin in 2018. In 2019, she won the Ivan Uritz Prize for Creative Experiment for the House of Atreus monologues. Also, a series of paintings and sculptures by Pete Swan, inspired by the house with only an attic and a basement, opened at One Paved Court Gallery in September 2020. She also writes essays and reviews, and after many years as a freelance writing tutor at the Poetry School and elsewhere, Kathryn is now pursuing a PhD in creative writing at Durham University. Hello, Kathryn Maris, and welcome to Planet Poetry.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
I'm so pleased you're able to come and speak with us today, because I loved your book, The House with Only an Attic and a Basement, which has got this one of those titles that you just want to pick it up. On the back cover, I thought it was interesting. Daljit Nagra said, "This is the funniest book I've read in years." And I'm not saying it wasn't funny, but I also found quite a sad undertone to it for me. I don't know. What do you think about that quote?
Well, it's the nature of the book blurb, right? They serve a marketing purpose. And I think, like absolutely everybody, I have a lot of ambivalence about book endorsements. Every writer does. But I think, unfortunately, blurbs don't seem to be going anywhere. And Daljit has had a lot of experience and has supported a lot of poets over the years. And he would know what kind of a blurb works as an effective soundbite, I guess.
Yeah.
I guess I've never set out to write a funny poem. I think my tone probably naturally veers towards something like maybe satire. And my mode is often actually self-satirical, like I'm making fun of myself more often than not. And if there's laughter, it might actually be a kind of uncomfortable laughter because I do push my poems into uncomfortable territories, and I try to go as far as I can to the line, whatever that line is, without actually crossing it. Sometimes I write earnest lyrics, but this book was probably a different kind of project.
Yeah. Yeah. Maybe you could read a poem here. And I was wondering about, towards the beginning of the collection, there's one called The X-Man. And it's one of a series, isn't it? Because we've got the H-Man later on and the A-Man. And it feels as if it introduces some of the subjects that crop up, such as the role of girls and
overbearing men and various other kind of little cross themes.
Sure, yeah. Well, The X-Man is one of a sequence of poems that I privately refer to as the alphabet males, which is sort of a play on alpha male. And the poems are meant to be light-hearted critiques of different kinds of male narcissism. So hence the superhero-like titles. But I think deep down, I'm probably like a frustrated fiction writer. So these are little lineated stories in which different kinds of genres intersect. They're part biography, part tall tale, part satire, part flash fiction. None of these alphabet male poems are based on anyone in particular, but people sometimes ask me if the X-Man is, the X-Man who's an artist is based on Lucian Freud. But it isn't really. The writer daughters are probably some version of me. The X-Man. His superpower was that his testicles manufactured sperm with exclusively X chromosomes, and that was ironic because not only was he a beast to women, but his 40 baby girls grew up seeking men like the father they barely saw unless they went to his studio to be painted, which wasn't okay with their mothers, who were not only jealous, but guilty of giving birth to girls who were products of an X chromosome-making monster and would soon suffer at the hands of other monsters with X-type sperm, thereby assuring the continuation of suffering. And meanwhile, all the girls became writers who slouched from sitting at desks and being daughters and lovers of beasts.
It's one long sentence, isn't it?
Yes, I am not 100% sure I've noticed that before. But I noticed it as I was reading it because obviously the book came out a couple of years ago and it's some time since I've revisited these poems. So I feel like a little surprised by them or something. And I thought, ooh, that's a hard one to find find a place to breathe.
Is this the first X in the book? Because we've got a lot of X's. Is it to do with something that's been excised or exited from? There's kind of a sort of connotation of leaving something or cancelling something out in my mind.
I think so. Yeah. And, you've got the Kathryn wheel, which is a circle figure. So you have the X and the O, which is sort of a hug and a kiss, right?
Yeah.
And I think the wheel figure is a kind of, it represents a kind of, at least in one of the poems, a kind of zero, right? So maybe there is something about erasing or excising in the book. And I guess the idea of an ex-partner comes up, but that comes up in a quite a fictional way, in that I have a poem about with the single N word, the X N word that comes up again and again. And that's a kind of cut and paste poem from a dating book I read somewhere. But yeah, even in the series of monologues, the House of Atreus, there's X. X comes up in a postcode and X like exit. Yeah, I don't think I've really thought about it. But you're right, there are a lot of X's in the book, yeah.
Maybe I'm reading too much into it there. There's certainly this theme of miscommunication or bad communication. We've got, lovers who don't understand each other. There's some fairly awful stories. A dating agency for married people offering its services, and women being given advice on how to compete with an ex. Is that an idea that was in your mind, or am I making that one up?
Well, no, that's actually a really astute comment because I think the book is very much about unreliable narration and identification and projection, and the distorted lenses through which I and probably everyone else perceives things. I think the book, I was just checking, I think the book has an epigraph from Freud about identification, which I hoped might give the reader a clue that what follows is going to be delivered through a very subjective lens. Even the very first poem, which probably reads like a sort of confessional lyric, is full of red flags that are meant to indicate the narrator is extremely unreliable and isn't remembering it quite right. And she's not using terms correctly. And she's conflating a past trauma with a present trauma, which is like not to say that there isn't some central truthiness to that tale. But the tale is told with such ugliness and provocation. So the teller becomes as narcissistic as the father figure. And that's an example of one of the ways I try to push narrative and point of view and tone to their extremes.
Would you like to read The Summer the Spike Went Into My...
Yeah. The summer day the spike went into my The summer day the spike went into my brother's head, as such things happened in the 20th century when the Freudian death drive was often accessed out of boredom, I learned from my doctor parents that scalps bleed profusely. 20 years later, when Theodore and Cosima jumped on little Robert's bed and Theodore fell off and his white blonde head turned red, I said, "Scalps bleed profusely," and Rachel, his mum, thanked me for my composure. Robert's mum, Emily, who had always wanted to be a jazz singer or actress and who always introduced me as a poetess, said she knew a couple who had a second child because their friend's child died in a freak accident. But back to the summer day the spike grazed my brother's scalp. I slept beside him in his racing car bed, and my father woke me and slapped my face, thinking, I assume, of sex, whereas I was already thinking about death.
Yeah, I see what you mean about the unreliable narrator, as it were.
Definitely. Like, first the spike goes into the brother's head, but then we learn the spike only grazed the scalp. And then, like, the Freudian death drive, I don't think that's what the Freudian death drive means. I think the death drive is something much more like id action rather than actually trying to kill yourself or something. Mm-hmm. So that there's just like, you just don't trust this narrator, I think. No one is heroic in my poems, least of all me. And almost none of the poems in the book are based on anything directly autobiographical. There's a sonnet about a doctor who says, good news, it's a demon.
Yes.
And that one, right? The doctor who identifies the demon in that poem, I think it was a really kindly figure. Like, I think people mean well, probably, in many of the poems. And that figure is based on, not on an obstetrician, but on a psychiatrist I saw when I had a bad episode of antenatal depression when I was pregnant with my daughter. The demon isn't the child, but it's something ugly and internal that gets externalized. And when people read that poem, they sometimes think it's about my son, but it's like I externalize this internal demon figure I portray it as a hulking teenage boy who needs care and attention and exercise. And the demon sort of serves a similar function to the Kathryn wheel that gets carried around in different poems. So I'll read Demon. Demon. Good news for the doctor, it's a demon. I asked for its name. Was it no one? Was it superego? He said it wasn't those, but he couldn't guess the name. Who knows, he said. It mightn't even be a demon. It's what we call a diagnosis by elimination. Explaining he couldn't operate, the doctor said, let's go ahead and medicate the hell out of it. Make it sleepy. I named him Demon after his identity. I put him to sleep twice a day, one short, one long. 3 times a week he did sport. He grew to 6'2". I said he was good. I went to the door of his room and left food.
So you have a lot of fun with overheard conversation, and there's some found poetry in here. And I noticed from in the back, you said that 1 or 2 of them were taken from emails. Were they actually verbatim from other people's emails?
Yeah, found poetry. Maybe a third of the poetry in this book is found in one way or another. I wouldn't do it again, though. I think I got it out of my system in this book.
Oh, that's interesting.
I think I was saying how I like to kind of push the line, and I was trying to kind of push things also with the use of the found text, I think, and question what's the boundary between self and other in a way. But mainly it was a way to explore voice, because I'm obsessed with voice. And I wanted to find a way to write lyrics that were plural and choral in some way. I wanted to find a way to share my voice with somebody else's and create something like a shared lyric or a new way of ventriloquizing and maybe de-emphasizing my own selfness. I think a lot of poets are deeply interested in exploring the self in their poems, where I wasn't that interested in doing that in this book. I wanted to make fictions and push voice as far as I could, sometimes using a modernist template, like in the poem Ladies' Voices, which is kind of based a little bit on the template of Gertrude Stein's little play, also called Ladies' Voices. And sometimes there could be an element of satire which comes from having an outsider status. So like maybe I was trying to capture something about English voice or something which felt very different to my own voice. And I think it might be important as context to think that the book was made in the run up to the referendum and just after, and that I took the Brexit vote deeply personally, even though people had all kinds of reasons. But for me, I guess the insularity I always felt at a gut level, as though no one really wanted me here, or my European American children or their European father. There maybe was some element of satire in some of the found poetry, but also, again, that kind of wanting to be connected, or wanting to, there was probably a bit of both, some kind of longing for a connection and at the same time some sort of outsider satirical eye.
Those are all reasons why I enjoyed it. I think there is, as you say, this element of lots of little fictions, and we are given so many interesting characters, often in a very kind of sly way. I mean, I'm looking at this little one, Information from the Headmaster, which is kind of, there was an incident on the river last week. And you're thinking, what was this incident? Which we never actually get to know, but there's lots of hints in there. And in the end, it's all fine because the teachers knew what they were doing. And I could just picture this coming in a sort of an email to the parents, supposedly to reassure them, and yet throwing up more questions than it answers. And I liked that kind of take on the stiff upper lip British understatement or whatever. That's how I read it.
Which I love, which I absolutely love. Like, I've loved that about the British voice or something ever since I read Agatha Christie books. Like, I am capturing something that in a way I admire very much. But I think that poem, which was just severely cut from a very long letter, it's meant to emphasize that thing about miscommunication and distortion, like, is that really how it happened? And I guess I use certain end words that are kind of sinister so that there's like a sub-narrative in a way. That was just me flirting with voice and experimenting with voice and taking on other voices. And
this is a question I've asked other guests on Planet Poetry, and it's about form. Unlike the Book of Jobs, one of your earlier books, I think in this book, there is more experimentation, perhaps, with form. There's a lot of different things going on.
I think you have to kind of get started with the poem, and then maybe the form starts to present itself to you. When I say you, I mean me. That poem, Demon, which turned out to be a sonnet, but it started out as a sestina, and I kept trying it as a sestina, and it didn't work. So something like 10 years later, I went back to it, and immediately it was obvious that it should have been a sonnet, but I just didn't see it back, 10 years before when I was less experienced. But I think it's also kind of like you have to want to write in the form. My middle book, God Loves You, is full of sonnets. That was me as an American experimenting. It was an experiment for me to be writing sonnets and sestinas and pantoums and things like that. Because I think at my age in the States, the people of my generation, things like writing sonnets were not that available to us. It was like a particular kind of neo-formalist group who did that. They tended to be men, and they tended to be on the kind of more conservative side of the spectrum. And somehow moving here, where people did regularly use sonnets still, it freed me up to feel like it was okay to write in forms. But I don't have too many forms. I do have, they're sometimes called prose poems, but I actually think, I don't mind how people want to label my work. I'm really not precious about that at all. But I'd say if it was up to me, I would call them more little stories. I would call them fiction. I think my second book, God Loves You, had this sequence of prose poems that were, I'd say, very much influenced by Maurice Riordan's Idylls in his third book, The Holy Land. But these, in this book, The House, I feel like they're just it was me trying to write little flash fiction as opposed to prose poems. They didn't necessarily have that torque or whatever it is that prose poems have. They were just more like little stories to me. I guess when people say forms, I somehow almost automatically seem to think that they're referring to received forms. So I'd say I have a mix of received forms and something like Ladies' Voices, which is in the template of a Gertrude Stein play. And I'd like to read that one, I think, because It also is an example of the use of found text,
Yeah.
which we talked about earlier. It uses texts from a WhatsApp group for school parents, and it repurposes them using as its structure that playlet I referred to by Gertrude Stein, which she wrote in 1916. And I wrote my little play 100 years later in 2016. And I gave it the same title as hers. Yeah, I'll read that one. Ladies' Voices. Curtain Raiser. Everyone has gone, but the barbecue is here. Is someone coming back for it? William is going back for it tomorrow. Ah, that belongs to William. William is going back tomorrow. What a successful weekend overall. Did anyone see a white china salad bowl? I'm looking for a plastic container with a red strip around the edge. Weren't we fortunate with the weather? Weren't we lucky? Wow, what a race. What a race indeed. Act 2. Accident on the M4 by the exit to the M25. We're stuck in it too. We are through. I'm driving Rupert, Henry, and the dog. Are you there yet? You will be fine. I was caught too. The rain is driving at an angle. Where are you all? We're all here. Where are you? Act 3. First Brexit, now this. What a week. So sad. I feel the way I did last Friday, totally bereft. Those boys are lucky with their great British strengths, calm under pressure, humility, and humor. Nick was telling us how he read the Odyssey. That will stand them in good stead. Act 4. What a shame. Big loss. It's a very difficult time. Equally painful. I saw them laughing. Epilogue. His father has been given 1 month to live. He's not ill at all. Does anyone have Nurofen? Oh dear, was it raining? Gosh, I will miss it, and you, very much. Congratulations and best wishes for the future. What a fabulous memory. Wasn't it just such a special and wonderful occasion? The baton is well and truly passed.
Thank you. Now, I don't know the Gertrude Stein piece. In what, is it just the shape, or is it the subject matter as well, or have you kind of repositioned that?
Oh, yeah. It's just the shape. So she has it in 4 parts, the curtain raiser, Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, or epilogue. I changed the form a little bit, I tried to keep the same number of lines in each section. So she had 5 sections: curtain raiser, Act 2, Act 3, Act 4, and then what she calls scene 2, to make it seem kind of like it's ending in the middle, but I turned that into an epilogue. Gertrude Stein was at an opera in 1916 in Mallorca, and she just jotted down the chatter that was happening during the interval. So hers makes, if I can say this, hers makes no sense at all. Whereas I wanted to create a narrative. I wanted to create I guess because it's that fiction writer in me or something, I really wanted to create a narrative. So I created a narrative arc out of these completely unrelated fragments from a WhatsApp group over a couple of years, I guess.
Now you've got a series of 3 short poems spaced through the collection, Kathryn and Her Wheel, 1, 2, and 3. I wanted to ask you about those and where they come from. I was intrigued by this character who, St. Catherine with the Kathryn wheel. Is it about, well, you tell me where it came from. It feels like it comes to kind of a nihilistic ending with this person. I felt quite sad about her in the end. Everything that she'd given to others, that she'd kind of borne it.
Yeah, you're not wrong to see something like nihilism in it, but I think I see something more positive. I seem to like to have women carrying things or something in my poems. So those prose poems in God Loves You, there were a series of 6 kind of written in a kind of gospel, biblical sort of language. And they were about this girl that carries this box around. And now there's this wheel in this poem. And I only really thought of that similarity now. But I think the wheel is, I don't know if it represents anything in particular, but maybe it's shame or victimhood or something like that. And that one can make a decision to sort of lug this thing around with one. It documents 3 different points of this woman's life, early before her marriage, and then later on, I guess, when she has children. those two are little stories. Like I was saying before, that I like to write little stories, and they're stories written in the third person. But then the final poem in the trilogy is narrated by the woman herself when she's old. And I sometimes wonder if it's like some older version of myself or something encouraging me to like just get rid of this wheel. Even the nihilism that one might feel, that there's some kind of beauty in that. Like in a way, there's a celebration of the zero-ness or the nullness of things, the nada de nada, the Spanish expression, absolutely nothing, that there's something beautiful about nothingness, and that the fact that one can find beauty even in nothingness means that there's joy in something, isn't there? So it was, it's almost like live seems to be the message. Just like, forget about this wheel and just live.
I can see that now. And what you said at the beginning as well, of the wheel being like a zero or an O or a nothing, actually makes sense. When you get to the end of your life, you might decide, actually, this is a zero, and it's felt like a burden, but it hasn't, because it is nothing. It's light. It's just a space. So tell me what you're working on now. Have you got any new work coming up?
I guess after the book came out, I spent a year or two doing more critical work. So I was publishing reviews for the TLS and other publications, kind of across genres, just to kind of read attentively and to think about things. I felt like I needed to read and absorb and think about things, and that maybe my modes of writing, like I need to go in a different direction. I guess each of my books is incredibly different, and I don't know what that different new thing is going to be next. But I found that the critical writing very, very difficult, very time consuming, usually relatively underpaid really for the amount of time one puts into it. I still do a bit of that, but I've started doing a PhD at Durham, and the funding there takes some of the pressure off of having to freelance and, extra things. So I'm just focusing on that, and I'm mainly just focusing on the reading and research and the critical side of things. And it is a creative writing PhD, and I will have to come up with something creative, but I don't actually know what that is. And I don't know if it will be poetry, if it will be prose. So I'd say it's a very transitional time, especially because it's been quite a difficult year for everybody, hasn't it? So I'd say I'm not working on anything in particular, but I do write the occasional sort of essay and review.
Well, that sounds quite encouraging, actually, because I was sort of think, oh goodness, got to keep writing, got to have something in the pipeline. But so I relate to what you're saying about reading and getting on with what you want to be doing, and letting the ideas or the work come when it's time. But it sounds very exciting to be doing a PhD and to have got funding for it. And yeah, fantastic. Kathryn, it's been such a pleasure to speak to you. Thank you for coming onto the podcast, and all the best with your projects.
Thank you for having me, Robin.
I enjoyed the interview you did with Kathryn Maris. I love what she was saying, calling some of her poems tall tales. That always makes me think of Flann O'Brien, or sort of that kind of more absurd humour. And when she was talking about alphabet males, that sequence of that she thought of a sequence of poems. But there's sort of little observations in it. There was the one she read about all the daughters of this terrible male. All the girls became writers who slouched from sitting at desks. That kind of lovely
really
picture that puts in your mind of like these 40 girls are all slouching because they're all writers, because they had a terrible father.
She has a quite sort of deadpan way of reading as well, doesn't she? Which also adds to that wry humour.
And that the poem about the demon, that sort of Rosemary's Baby type story where the protagonist gives birth to a demon, and
yes,
when it grows up to be over 6 foot, I went to his door and left food. I found that very funny.
I found it funny, but also quite sort of moved at the end. It seemed to sort of turn on a penny there, from good news, it's a demon, and you're sort of like, oh, ha, ha, ha. And then thinking, oh, actually, this could be quite serious, really.
Yeah.
It's a serious topic.
Yeah, she said her tone was like uncomfortable laughter, if there was laughter there. And I think she was full of interesting thoughts. This idea that nobody was heroic in her poems as well, because that always leaves room for comedy, because if everybody's a bit shabby and faulted, then those people interacting with one another is always going to create comedy, I think.
Like some of the found poems or conversations of between people, is that kind of thing.
You said there was a poem based on a schoolmaster's email.
Yes, there's this poem called Information from the Headmaster. So it's, as you know, there was an incident on the river last week. I don't think Kathryn read this one, but
No.
it goes on to talk about, one of our fifth form crews got caught on some moorings below Chiswick Pier. When the boat sank, one boy went into the water, and then it's just like, but it was fine because the teacher saved him, and we don't need to worry. It's all been sorted. So it's just like, what?
She has this real focus on voice. The fact that a lot of the voices in this particular project are sort of found voices, and she was talking about choral voices. Many people speaking at the same time as well, which I thought was great.
In the sense of the House of Atreus, the kind of the Greek chorus, I guess.
And there was that the ladies' voices, that thing that was a bit like a play that was constructed from WhatsApp messages, I think she said. But I guess what most admire about her is this kind of, she dares to be fictional, with these tall tales and just to make stuff up. And I do get a bit tired of this kind of endless parading of authenticity, and I find this idea of, being fictional versus being authentic and being, true to yourself and everything, a bit of a false opposition, because I think people have always used, fiction to get to truths and to different kinds of truths. And it was just so refreshing, that she was being so playful about the idea of fiction in poetry.
I agree totally. And she said, didn't she, there was a poem that people have said to her, oh, is that about your son? And she said that there are aspects of her characters woven here and there, but that they are works of fiction. And you're right. I feel like sometimes we've stepped away from that. People assume you're writing a poem, therefore it must have an autobiographical edge to it. But there's a difference, isn't there, between using your lived experience and telling the truth, as in the absolute truth.
This age of identity politics and so on, people are quite often driven to explore their own identities and, talk about their differences. But sometimes it can just be like a hall of mirrors, it's like, look at me from all these different angles.
Good point.
And I just find people who dare to be fictional, I find that really interesting. I think it goes all the way back to monologues in poetry, that back to Browning and way beyond that, of people just taking on different personas and running with those and seeing what happens and what truths they discover that way, rather than always relentlessly talking about their own experience.
Yeah,
but then that's just me being an old curmudgeon.
No, perfectly valid point and interesting.
So it's about this time in our show that we ask each other what we've been reading. So, Robin, what have you been reading?
Well, of course, other than all the academic, scholarly articles that I've had to be reading lately, I have had through my letterbox recently the most recent issue of Rattle magazine, which is
I've not seen that for a while.
Yeah, it's an American magazine, and I really enjoy it. It's different though. It's so different. Every time I open it, I start reading the poems, and I just think, gosh, these are not poems that I would read in any UK magazines. It feels like a different genre. And I don't know, I also feel that with Poetry magazine, Chicago Poetry, when it comes through. And I wonder whether I'm just becoming more divorced from that way of writing. To begin with, I loved it though, and I sort of aspired to writing more in the American style, but it seems very different. Do you know what I mean? I suppose much more fluid forms.
Is the subject matter different?
The subject matter quite often is different, and I suppose it's partly cultural differences. I don't always get the references. Often they are to things that are topical in the United States, I guess, or they are related to people's upbringings in certain parts of the country. They have a cultural diversity that is sometimes it takes a bit of reading to kind of get into it. But it is still refreshing, though. I mean, I enjoy reading stuff that's more challenging, or that I have to think, gosh, where is this coming from, or what am I to get from this? And it's also fun to read work by people whose names I'm not familiar with at all. And one thing I do really like, and almost the main reason I keep subscribing to it, is there's always a long interview with a poet at the end by the editor. And they do these interviews on Skype or something, and they're written down absolutely verbatim. And they go on for 20 or 30 pages, but they're always really interesting, because quite often it's the life story of the life history of these people that get interviewed, but it's all very conversational, and there's lots of anecdotes, and there's lots of detail that I find fascinating. And it's always poets that I've never heard of, and yet they've had these long, illustrious careers over the other side of the water.
If only there was a podcast that did stuff like that.
One thing I'm not so keen on is they have these contributor notes. So instead of the classic poet biogs, which I rather like, the first thing I read in a magazine usually, these are quite cutesy and a bit sort of, I think you're asked to write something about what inspires you, or something, not like a list of where you've been published or anything. So you get people talking about how they first started writing, and sometimes it's interesting, but sometimes it's not.
Did you subscribe to a couple of American magazines then?
The other one I subscribe to is Poetry, which I've subscribed to for a long time. Although I think there've been some controversial work published there. I don't know if you're aware, there was a big blow up last year where the long-standing editor Don Scher fell on his sword after a poem was published that got completely slated in social media for various reasons. And they call it cancelling, don't they? I think he got cancelled, basically, and to a certain extent the magazine, which is I'm sure Poetry is big enough to ride that storm, because it's been going for over 110 years, I think. The longest running poetry magazine in the world, as far as I know. So hopefully it'll pick itself up and brush itself down and keep going, because it would be a shame to see something like that blasted out of the water.
Things have changed, because there's that sort of conventional wisdom that if something generates a response, or even if people don't like it, it would generate interest and debate around the magazine. But the resignation and kind of cancelling of the editor is quite drastic, really. It
is drastic, and I don't even pretend to know what really is going on in the poetry world, but clearly it's not an isolated thing. I read a long piece in the Dark Horse magazine, which is a Scottish journal, again, long-standing, recently, by somebody who had incurred the wrath of sectors of the community, and she'd endured months and months of vitriolic, and it's not just people slagging her off on social media, it's people phoning up places where she had a contract, or places that had engaged her to do readings or to do workshops, and getting them to cancel the contract with her, and making people who are going to read with her not read with her, or say, I'm not going to read at that festival because she's there, putting pressure on people. And I don't really know where to begin to understand what that's all about, really.
God, it would be horrible to be on the receiving end of that.
It did. Reading it was quite, it felt, I felt traumatized just reading it, thinking, God, that could be any of us. What the hell? What do you do?
We're at a strange time in culture now where you're not allowed to make a mistake. One incident, one kind of aberrant moment, and that's you done forever, and it's surely as all humans make mistakes and, say idiotic things from time to time.
Well, you think so, wouldn't you? And we're not talking about people who put themselves in the public eye and stand, politicians or whoever standing up and representing the moral order. We're talking about people like you and I just trying to make a living and just trying to do what they love for their living and working hard at it and for other people, suddenly having nothing. But anyway, Rattle magazine. a good read. Oh, I ought to mention also that they do this an annual chapbook competition, and they send out the winning chapbook to all their subscribers. They've got like thousands of subscribers, and you just get sent out this chapbook for free. I think that the Rattle Foundation, which is behind it, have a lot of dough. And this, again, is an American thing. I think there are some arts journals that have good levels of funding.
How great to be the person with that chapbook suddenly sent to,
I know.
a whole database
is.
of people.
And they're short, but they're beautiful, and I always read them.
Excellent.
And how about you, Peter? Tell me what you've managed to read in between all your work Zoom meetings and your copywriting, scribblings.
Scribblings? You've been talking to my clients again.
Dismissing his creative output.
So, well, I have made a little bit of time for reading poetry, and I've basically stumbled across what may be the future of poetry. And I'm going to surprise you first by just reading the poem itself, and then we can discuss it.
Excellent.
I've been searching for the appropriate poetry voice for this, but I'll give it my best shot. And soon I am staring out again. Begin to practice my words, expecting my word will come. It will not. The wind is cawing. My friend is near. I hear his breath. His breath is not the air. He touches me again with his hands and tells me I am growing old, he says, far old. We travel across an empty field in my heart. There is nothing in the dark, I think, but he. I close my eyes and try to remember what I was. He says it was an important and interesting day, because I put in his hands one night the box of light that had been a tree.
Deep
What do you
stuff.
make of that?
Well, apart from he touches me again with his hands, I wonder what other body part he might be touching him with, and a few other bits and bobs. Yeah.
Wow. There's quite a lot of emphasis on tactility in that poem. Turns out it was written by an algorithm. It's basically a robot and the robot's poetry. Unfortunately, this poor robot has received a hell of a lot of criticism already because it's been in a project led by the artist S. Devlin and the brand agency Avant-Garde, and helped by the Google Arts and Culture Lab. They created this poetry writing algorithm, and the poems this poor algorithm wrote were sent to the Poetry Society and people from the Poetry Archive and Scottish Poetry Library. People in those establishments filtered through the thousands of couplets that this algorithm wrote and rejected them and kind of gave the algorithm feedback to help it improve. And Tracy Gueri, director of the Poetry Archive, said, I think we all individually went through 40,000 couplets at the end. So this poor robot has been rejected 40,000 times. But anyway, I thought it was quite interesting.
And still it comes up with this. Yes, I think you sort of think, have these poets not got something better to do than to read a load of computer-generated stuff?
Well, they fed in loads of, they got the algorithm to absorb poetry written in the UK. Lots of great poets this algorithm has studied. I like the idea, because there's this argument in literary criticism about, I think it's intentionality, how important is the writer's intention in how you receive the work. Obviously, there is no poet, but you still, as a reader, bring something to it and kind of some things detonate in your head,
Yeah, but this is, in this case, it's only what the reader brings to it. There's nothing else. So this has not been produced by a sentient being. And that's the key, isn't it? I mean, these AI, it's been around for so long, these things. I mean, certainly Google has had a kind of AI poetry generator for some years that you can go in and you put in 2 or 3 words and it comes out with a poem. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if some of those do get sent in for competitions, and who knows, maybe they've won, who knows. But it is intriguing, of course. Everything to do with AI is intriguing on some level or other, even if you run away from it in horror. But I just remember my first encounter with AI was at university in the early 1980s, and we were.
You've never mentioned this, Robin.
We were. Yeah, I did. My first degree was in linguistics and cognitive studies, and we were at Sussex, and we had tutors there who were at the forefront of some of this early thinking on AI, including a woman called Margaret Bowden, who was the professor there, and she wrote this book called Artificial Intelligence and Natural Man, which is still on my bookshelf. I still look at it occasionally. It's sort of prophetic in some ways, but the point is that at that stage they were building robots who could pick up a block and put it on top of another block, and there was sort of, even that was, thousands of pages of code, and the point being, I suppose, that this algorithm can do a huge number of things better than humans. But why bother spending time getting it to do the things that we will always do better than them? Let's use computers for what we can't do. I mean, it's just totally illogical to me. Why spend time getting a computer to write poetry? It's hard enough for humans.
Well, I, for one, am looking forward to the day when an algorithm can be poet laureate. I don't see why they should be discriminated against.
I'm all for those robotic hoovers that go around the house, or robotic lawnmowers. They look like fun, actually. I could set one of them loose.
But one that could read sonnets to you as it did it. You've seen the future here, folks.
That's it. You have.